The hospice nurse had just left the room when David's fingers tightened around mine with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a man whose body had been ravaged by pancreatic cancer for 18 months. His eyes, once a vibrant green that used to catch the morning light through our bedroom window, were now clouded and distant, focused on something I couldn't see. But in that moment, they cleared just enough to find mine, and his cracked lips moved with an urgency that made my heart clench. "Rebecca," he whispered, each word costing him something precious. "Check the attic, behind the Christmas boxes. Promise me." I leaned closer, my tears falling onto the white hospital blanket we'd brought from home, because he said it smelled like us, like our life together. "I promise, baby, I promise. But don't go. Please don't go yet." His thumb traced a small circle on my palm, the way he'd done for 23 years every time he held my hand. Then his grip loosened, his chest rose one final time, and at 3:47 in the morning on October 12th, my husband left me alone in a world that suddenly felt impossibly vast and terrifyingly empty. The funeral was a blur of casseroles and condolences, of people telling me how strong I was when I didn't feel strong at all. I felt like a shell, moving through the motions of greeting distant cousins and college friends who materialized out of politeness and then disappeared back into their own lives. My sister Clara stayed for 3 days, sleeping in the guest room and making me tea I didn't drink, before she had to return to Phoenix for her own family, her own life that was still whole and continuing. 2 weeks passed before I could even think about his words. 2 weeks of sleeping on his side of the bed because mine felt too empty, of leaving his coffee mug on the counter because washing it felt like erasing him, of sitting in his study surrounded by his law books and the faint smell of his cologne that was fading a little more each day. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray and cold, when I finally stood at the bottom of the attic stairs. The pull-down ladder creaked as I unfolded it, the same sound it had made for all the years we'd lived in this house on Maple Street, the house we'd bought in 2002 for $178,000, when we still believed we had forever stretching out before us. David had always been the one to climb up here, to wrestle down the Christmas decorations each December, to store away the summer clothes each fall. I'd only been up here maybe 5 times in 2 decades. The air was thick with dust and the peculiar smell of old cardboard and insulation. A single bulb hung from a beam, casting long shadows across the plywood floor. I could see our life archived in cardboard boxes, with my handwriting on the sides. Sarah's baby clothes, tax returns 2015 to 2019, wedding photos, duplicates, everything we'd meant to sort through someday. That mythical day when we'd have time, when we weren't rushing to soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and anniversary dinners and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that I would do anything to have back. The Christmas boxes were exactly where they always were, stacked against the far wall under the eave where the roof sloped down. I had to crouch as I made my way across the dusty boards, my knees protesting because I was 51 years old, and grief had aged me in ways that had nothing to do with years. There were 5 boxes, each one labeled in David's precise handwriting. Ornaments, fragile, lights, tested 2023. Nativity set, stockings and garland, tree topper, and miscellaneous. Behind them, pushed into the darkest corner, was a large plastic storage container I'd never seen before. It was navy blue, the kind you could buy in any Target or Walmart. Completely unremarkable, except for the fact that it existed in a space I thought I knew. My hands trembled as I pulled it forward, the plastic scraping against the rough plywood. It wasn't locked, wasn't even taped shut. The lid came off easily, as if it had been opened recently, as if David had been up here preparing for this moment, knowing it would come. Inside were files. Manila folders, dozens of them, organized with the same meticulous care David brought to everything. And on top, a white envelope with my name written in his handwriting, the letters shaky in a way his writing had never been before the cancer, before the chemotherapy that had stolen so much from him. I sat down right there on the dirty attic floor, holding that envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe, because maybe it did. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to disturb whatever David had hidden up here in the darkness. But I'd promised him. In his last moments, when every word was a gift, he'd used his precious remaining breath to tell me to look. So I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out 3 sheets of yellow legal paper covered in his handwriting. "My dearest Rebecca," it began, and I could hear his voice so clearly it was like he was sitting beside me in the dust and shadows. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and I'm so sorry to leave you with this burden. But you need to know the truth about our marriage, about the life we built, about the lies I've been living with for 15 years. I've tried to tell you so many times, stood at the edge of confession 100 different moments. But I was a coward. I chose silence over honesty. And now you're left to sort through the wreckage of my deception." My breath caught. Deception. The word looked wrong in his handwriting. Impossible. David had been the most honest man I'd ever known, the kind of person who drove back to the grocery store if the cashier gave him too much change, who told the truth even when it cost him. What could he possibly mean? I read on, my eyes blurring with tears that I kept wiping away because I needed to see every word. In 2010, when I took that job at Morrison & Associates, do you remember how relieved we were? How we celebrated with that $89 bottle of wine we couldn't really afford because finally we had financial security. Sarah was starting middle school, we were drowning in debt from your father's medical bills, and my salary at the firm was our salvation. $127,000 a year. It felt like we'd won the lottery. I remembered. God, I remembered. We'd sat at our little kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg that David kept meaning to fix, and we'd toasted to our future, to college funds and retirement accounts, and maybe, someday, that trip to Italy we'd always dreamed about. We kissed across the rim of our wine glasses and made love that night with a joy we hadn't felt in years, the heavy weight of financial fear finally lifting from our shoulders. "What I didn't tell you," his letter continued, "was the real reason Morrison offered me that position. It wasn't because of my brilliant legal mind or my stellar GMAC record. It was because I agreed to do something that went against everything I believed in, everything I'd been taught about justice and ethics and the law. They needed someone to bury evidence in the Hartley manufacturing case. You remember it. It was all over the news. The factory workers who were getting sick from chemical exposure, the families begging for accountability. Morrison represented Hartley, and there were internal documents proving the company knew about the contamination for years. Documents that could have won those families millions in compensation, could have forced real change, could have saved lives." The attic seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the letter tighter, my knuckles white. The Hartley case. I did remember. It had been a huge story. 73 workers filing suit, claiming the factory had knowingly exposed them to toxic chemicals that caused cancer, respiratory disease, birth defects in their children. The case had dragged on for 3 years before being settled for what the news called an undisclosed amount, which usually meant the victims got far less than they deserved. Morrison himself called me into his office, David's letter went on. And I could picture that office, the one time I'd been there for a firm Christmas party, all dark wood and leather and windows overlooking the city. He said I had potential, that I could go far in the firm, but I needed to prove I was a team player. He put those documents in front of me, 47 pages of internal memos and test results and executive emails that spelled out exactly what Hartley Manufacturing had done. And then he told me to make them disappear, not destroy them, that would be illegal, but bury them so deep in discovery documents, cross-referenced in such confusing ways, tagged with such misleading labels that opposing counsel would never find them. He said it was just strategic filing, that every firm did it, that this was how the game was played. I pressed my hand against my mouth, fighting the nausea rising in my throat. This couldn't be David. Not my David, who had gone to law school because he believed in justice, who used to come home frustrated and angry when he saw the system fail people who needed it most. Not the man who had coached Little League and volunteered at the food bank and taught our daughter that integrity was worth more than any amount of money. I should have said no. The letter continued, his handwriting getting shakier, harder to read, as if the act of writing this confession was physically painful. I should have walked out of that office and never looked back. But Rebecca, I thought about you. I thought about Sarah, about the braces she needed that cost $6,800, about the medical bills from your father's stroke that were drowning us, about our mortgage payment that was 3 months behind. I thought about how tired you looked working double shifts at the hospital, coming home with your feet swollen and your back aching. I thought about how I was supposed to be the provider, the one who took care of our family, and I was failing. So I said yes. I took those documents and I buried them exactly as Morrison instructed. I became part of the machine that denied 73 families their justice so that my family could have security. The attic was completely silent except for the sound of my breathing, harsh and ragged. Outside, I could hear a dog barking in the distance, a car driving past, the normal sounds of a world that was continuing while mine fell apart. I looked at the boxes around me, all the accumulated stuff of our life together, and wondered how many of these things had been bought with blood money. The Christmas ornaments Sarah had picked out at Target, the new water heater we'd installed in 2012, the vacation to Disney World in 2014 where we'd spent $4,300 and Sarah had hugged Mickey Mouse and I thought we were the luckiest family alive. I forced myself to keep reading. The case settled 6 months later. The families received $3.2 million total, split among 73 plaintiffs. Do the math, Rebecca. That's about $43,000 each, before legal fees. Most of them walked away with maybe $25,000 after their lawyers took their cut. For cancers that would cost hundreds of thousands to treat. For children who would grow up with developmental disabilities. For lives that were irrevocably destroyed. And it was my fault. If I had let those documents surface, if I had done the right thing, they would have won their case. The jury would have seen the truth. They would have gotten the tens of millions they deserved. And Hartley Manufacturing would have been forced to clean up their factory, to change their practices, to prevent future harm. My tears were falling freely now, dropping onto the yellow paper and smudging the ink. I thought about those families, people I'd never met but whose suffering had indirectly paid for my comfortable life. I thought about the children with birth defects, the workers dying of cancer, the spouses left behind to grieve and struggle. And I thought about my husband, my good, kind husband, carrying this weight for 15 years, letting it eat away at him from the inside. Morrison gave me a $20,000 bonus that year, called it a reward for my exceptional organizational skills. I deposited it in our account and you were so happy because we could finally pay off the credit cards, finally breathe a little easier. You asked me if I'd gotten a promotion, and I said something vague about the firm appreciating my work. I let you believe I'd earned that money honestly. Every time I looked at you after that, I felt like a fraud. I remembered that bonus. I remembered how we'd gone out to dinner at that nice Italian restaurant downtown, the one where a meal for two cost $187 with tip, and we'd felt wealthy and successful, and like everything was finally coming together. I'd worn my blue dress, the one David always said brought out my eyes, and he'd held my hand across the table and told me he loved me. How much had it cost him to smile that night? How much had it cost him to pretend? After that, the letter went on, it got easier. That's the horrible part, Rebecca. The first time nearly killed me. I couldn't sleep for weeks. But then Morrison gave me another case, and each time it got a little bit simpler to do what needed to be done. I told myself I was just doing my job, that every lawyer bent the rules sometimes, that I had to think about our family first. I became very good at strategic filing, at making inconvenient documents vanish into bureaucratic mazes. I got promoted to senior associate in 2013, made partner in 2016. My salary grew to $187,000, then $215,000, then $263,000 last year. We bought the new car, renovated the kitchen for $43,000, helped Sarah with her college tuition. Every good thing in our life was built on a foundation of other people's suffering. I set the letter down for a moment, my hands shaking too badly to hold it. The plastic storage container sat in front of me, full of files I hadn't yet examined. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But David had asked me to check the attic, had used his dying breath to send me here, and I owed him the courage to see this through. I picked up the first file. It was labeled Hartley Manufacturing, Buried Documents. Inside were photocopies of the internal memos David had mentioned, the smoking gun evidence that would have changed everything. I saw an email from a Hartley executive dated March 2009. We've known about the TCE contamination in the groundwater since 2006. Legal advises we maintain plausible deniability. Do not put anything else in writing. I saw test results showing chemical levels 200 times above safe limits. I saw a memo discussing the cost-benefit analysis of settling future lawsuits versus installing proper filtration systems. The filtration would cost $8 million. They decided the lawsuits would be cheaper. I picked up another file. Westbrook Pharmaceuticals. Another. Sunrise Nursing Homes. Another. Cascade Construction. File after file, case after case, spanning 15 years. Each one contained evidence that should have seen the light of day, that should have been presented to juries, that should have brought justice to people who had been harmed by corporate negligence and greed. Each one buried by my husband's capable hands. Each one a betrayal of everything the law was supposed to stand for. There must have been 30 files in that container, 30 cases where David had made truth disappear. I pulled out a spreadsheet, meticulously maintained in his handwriting, documenting each case, the estimated number of victims, the settlements amounts they'd received versus what they should have gotten with full disclosure of evidence. The numbers were staggering. Collectively, these buried documents had likely cost victims tens of millions of dollars in compensation. Lives had been destroyed while David and I had lived comfortably in our house on Maple Street, planning vacations and attending Sarah's school plays and worrying about normal things like whether to refinish the hardwood floors. I returned to the letter, needing to hear his voice, needing to understand how the man I loved had become someone I didn't recognize. 5 years ago, he wrote, I started having panic attacks. Remember when I told you it was just stress from work? I'd be in the middle of a meeting and suddenly I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, felt like I was dying. My therapist, Dr. Chen, the one I told you was helping me with work stress, she knew the truth. I told her everything and she said I was experiencing moral injury, that my conscience was at war with my actions. She recommended I quit the firm, maybe report what I knew, try to make amends. But by then, we had the bigger house. Sarah was at Georgetown at $62,000 a year. You'd cut back your hours at the hospital to part-time because I told you we didn't need the money. How could I tear down everything I'd built? How could I tell you that our life was a lie? I thought about those panic attacks, how scared I'd been watching David struggle to breathe, how he'd waved off my concern and said it was nothing, just work pressure, just getting older. He'd seen Dr. Chen every Tuesday for 2 years. I thought he was being so responsible, taking care of his mental health. I never knew he was in therapy trying to live with the weight of his own choices. When I got the cancer diagnosis, the letter continued, and his handwriting here was almost illegible, as if the memory was too painful to record clearly. My first thought was that it was punishment. Poetic justice, maybe. Dr. Chen said that wasn't how cancer worked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my body was finally expressing what my conscience had been screaming all along. I'd poisoned myself with secrets the same way Hartley had poisoned those workers with chemicals. I pressed my fist against my mouth to stifle a sob. 18 months of watching him die, of holding his hand through chemotherapy sessions, of cleaning up when he was too weak to make it to the bathroom, of lying beside him at night listening to his labored breathing and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in to let him stay just a little longer. And the whole time, he'd been carrying this. I need you to understand something, Rebecca, the letter went on, and here his tone changed, became more urgent. I'm not telling you this to absolve myself. There is no absolution for what I've done. I'm telling you because these files are evidence that still matters. Some of these cases are still within the statute of limitations for filing ethics complaints, for reopening investigations, for maybe finally getting justice for at least some of the people I helped hurt. Morrison and Associates is still out there, still doing what they do, still teaching young lawyers that this is how the game is played. Someone needs to stop them. Someone needs to be brave in the way I never was. My heart started racing as I realized what he was asking, what he was laying at my feet with his confession. This wasn't just about unburdening his conscience. This was about action, about accountability, about trying to repair a fraction of the damage he'd done. I know this is unfair, he wrote. I know I'm dumping this on you when you're already dealing with grief and loss and the aftermath of my death. But Rebecca, I've watched you for 23 years. I've seen your fierce sense of right and wrong, the way you advocated for your patients even when it cost you politically at the hospital, the way you taught Sarah to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. You're the bravest person I know, and I failed to live up to your example every single day. Maybe you can do what I couldn't. Maybe you can make this mean something. The letter was almost done now, just half a page left. I could barely see through my tears to read it. I've left instructions in one of the files about how to contact the State Bar Association, which cases have the strongest evidence, which journalists might be interested in the story. I've also left the passwords to my work computer and my email accounts, though I'm sure Morrison will have scrubbed everything the moment I'm gone. But these paper files, they can't scrub these. I made copies of everything, kept them hidden. One final act of conscience in a career defined by its absence. When I got the cancer diagnosis, the letter continued, and his handwriting here was almost illegible, as if the memory was too painful to record clearly. My first thought was that it was punishment. Poetic justice, maybe. Dr. Chen said that wasn't how cancer worked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that my body was finally expressing what my conscience had been screaming all along. I'd poisoned myself with secrets the same way Hartley had poisoned those workers with chemicals. I pressed my fist against my mouth to stifle a sob. 18 months of watching him die, of holding his hand through chemotherapy sessions, of cleaning up when he was too weak to make it to the bathroom, of lying beside him at night listening to his labored breathing and praying to a God I wasn't sure I believed in to let him stay just a little longer. And the whole time, he'd been carrying this. "I need you to understand something, Rebecca," the letter went on, and here his tone changed, became more urgent. "I'm not telling you this to absolve myself. There is no absolution for what I've done. I'm telling you because these files are evidence, evidence that still matters. Some of these cases are still within the statute of limitations for filing ethics complaints, for reopening investigations, for maybe finally getting justice for at least some of the people I helped hurt. Morrison and Associates is still out there, still doing what they do, still teaching young lawyers that this is how the game is played. Someone needs to stop them. Someone needs to be brave in the way I never was." My heart started racing as I realized what he was asking, what he was laying at my feet with his confession. This wasn't just about unburdening his conscience. This was about action, about accountability, about trying to repair a fraction of the damage he'd done. "I know this is unfair," he wrote. "I know I'm dumping this on you when you're already dealing with grief and loss and the aftermath of my death. But Rebecca, I've watched you for 23 years. I've seen your fierce sense of right and wrong, the way you advocated for your patients even when it cost you politically at the hospital, the way you taught Sarah to stand up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. You're the bravest person I know, and I fail to live up to your example every single day. Maybe you can do what I couldn't. Maybe you can make this mean something." The letter was almost done now, just half a page left. I could barely see through my tears to read it. "I've left instructions in one of the files about how to contact the State Bar Association, which cases have the strongest evidence, which journalists might be interested in the story. I've also left the passwords to my work computer and my email accounts, though I'm sure Morrison will have scrubbed everything the moment I'm gone. But these paper files, they can't scrub these. I made copies of everything, kept them hidden. One final act of conscience in a career defined by its absence." I carefully placed David's letter back in the envelope and picked up the file labeled Instructions, Bar Association Complaint. Inside was a detailed outline in David's handwriting, walking through the process of filing an ethics complaint against himself, posthumously, against Morrison and Associates, against the other attorneys who had been part of these cases. He'd included names, dates, case numbers, everything I would need to make a compelling report. At the bottom of the file was a business card for someone named Margaret Reeves at the State Bar Ethics Division, with a note in David's handwriting. "She's known for taking on big firms. She'll listen." I pulled out my phone, checking the time. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. Late enough that the office might be closed, early enough that someone might still be there. My finger hovered over the screen as I looked up the number for the State Bar Association. This was the moment. This was the choice that would determine what came next, that would define how I carried David's memory forward, that would decide whether his confession meant anything or whether it was just words on paper, absolution sought but not earned. My call was answered on the third ring. A woman's voice, professional and crisp. "State Bar Association Ethics Division, this is Margaret Reeves." I took a breath. The kind of breath you take before diving into deep water, before stepping off a cliff, before changing your life in ways you can't predict or control. "Miss Reeves," I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. My husband, David Thornton, was a partner at Morrison and Associates. He passed away 2 weeks ago, and I need to report attorney misconduct spanning 15 years. I have documented evidence of deliberately buried discovery materials in dozens of cases, evidence that denied justice to hundreds of victims. How much time do you have? Because this is going to take a while. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of papers rustling, a chair creaking. "Mrs. Thornton," she said carefully, "are you certain you want to do this? These kinds of allegations, especially against a deceased attorney, can be complicated, painful. There will be investigations, publicity, potential legal ramifications for your family." I looked at the files spread around me in the attic, at the evidence of lives destroyed and justice denied. I thought about the woman with the 6-year-old boy, about the workers who died of cancer, about all the people whose names I didn't know, but whose suffering had bought my comfortable life. "I'm certain," I said. "Can you meet with me tomorrow?" "I can meet with you tonight," Margaret Reeves said, and I could hear a new energy in her voice, the sound of someone who knew she was about to uncover something significant. "If you have documentation, I want to see it as soon as possible. Cases this old, we need to move quickly to preserve whatever evidence still exists." We arranged to meet at her office at 7 o'clock. That gave me just over 2 hours to load the files into my car, to prepare myself for what would come next, to say goodbye to the life I'd thought I was living. I gathered up the folders carefully, reverently almost, treating them with the respect they should have received 15 years ago. Each one represented people who deserved better, who deserved truth, who deserved someone to finally stand up and say that what happened to them was wrong. As I climbed down from the attic, my arms full of evidence, I thought about David's last words: check the attic. Not, "I love you," not, "take care of Sarah," not any of the sweet final things dying people are supposed to say. He'd used his last breath to send me on this journey, to hand me the burden of his conscience, to ask me to do what he'd been too afraid to do in life. Was I angry with him? God, yes. Furious, betrayed, every good memory now tainted with the knowledge of how it had been purchased. But I was also heartbroken for the man he could have been, for the person he'd wanted to be when he was young and idealistic and believed that law was about justice. Somewhere along the way, he'd taken a wrong turn, made a bad choice, and then made it again and again until it became who he was. And he'd hated himself for it, carried that hatred until it manifested as cancer, whether that was scientifically true or not. That was punishment enough, maybe, or maybe not. I didn't know anymore. What I did know was that I had a choice he'd never made. I could choose truth over comfort, justice over reputation, doing what was right over doing what was easy. It wouldn't bring David back. It wouldn't undo the harm that had been done, but it might prevent future harm. It might force Morrison and Associates to change their practices, to teach their young lawyers that some lines can't be crossed no matter the reward. It might get some small measure of compensation for families who had been cheated. It might mean something. I loaded the files into my car, all 30 of them, the plastic container barely fitting in my trunk. As I backed out of the driveway, I looked at the house David and I had shared for 18 years, the house where we'd raised Sarah, where we laughed and thought and made love and grown older together. It looked the same as it always had, white siding and black shutters and the front porch that needed repainting. But it wasn't the same. It would never be the same again. At a red light 3 blocks from home, I called Sarah. She was at work, but answered anyway, because she always answered when I called, especially since David died. "Mom, are you okay? You sound weird." "Sarah," I said, and I had to force the words past the lump in my throat. "I need to tell you something about your father, something important. Can you come over tonight, after dinner?" "You're scaring me," she said. "What's wrong? What happened?" "I'll explain everything," I said. "I promise. But I need to do something first. I need to meet with someone. Can you be at the house by 9? She agreed, worry clear in her voice. and I hung up before she could ask more questions. I didn't want to have this conversation over the phone. Didn't want to tell her that her childhood had been built on corruption, that her college education had been funded by other people's suffering, that her hero father had feet of clay and hands stained with moral compromise. But she needed to know. She deserved to know. And maybe, together, we could figure out how to move forward with this knowledge. Margaret Reeves's office was in a nondescript building downtown, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing. She met me in the lobby, a woman in her mid-50s with gray-streaked hair and sharp, intelligent eyes behind frameless glasses. She took one look at the container I was struggling to carry and grabbed the other side without a word, helping me navigate it into the elevator and down a hallway to a small conference room. "Coffee?" she asked, and I nodded gratefully. While she was gone, I started pulling out files, arranging them on the conference table in chronological order. Hartley Manufacturing first, then Westbrook Pharmaceuticals, then all the others, a timeline of moral compromise stretching across 15 years. When she came back with 2 steaming mugs, she stopped in the doorway, just staring at the array of files covering the table. "Jesus," she said quietly. "How long did he do this?" "Since 2010, I said, "until he got too sick to work, which was about 18 months ago. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in April 2023. He died 2 weeks ago. And in his last moments, he told me to check the attic." She sat down across from me, opening the first file, scanning the documents with a practiced eye. I watched her face as she read, saw anger flicker across her features, saw her jaw tighten. "Mrs. Thornton," she said after several minutes, "do you understand what you're handing me here? This is evidence of systemic ethics violations at one of the biggest law firms in the state. This could destroy Morrison and Associates. It will certainly destroy your husband's reputation, and it will be brutal for you and your family." "I know," I said simply. "You could walk away right now," she said, looking up from the file to meet my eyes. "You could take these files home, put them back in the attic, forget you ever saw them. No one would blame you. Your husband is gone. This won't bring him back. It will just bring you pain. It will also bring justice. Maybe, at least to some people. And it might stop Morrison from doing this to future clients. Isn't that worth the pain?" She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "it is. But I need you to be sure, Mrs. Thornton. Once I file this complaint, once this investigation starts, there's no stopping it. Are you sure?" I thought about David, about the panic attacks he'd hidden from me, about the weight he'd carried for 15 years, about Dr. Chen, the therapist who'd known the truth, who'd encouraged him to come forward, to make amends, about those 73 families from the Hartley case, about the woman with the 6-year-old boy, about all the people whose names I would never know, but whose lives had been diminished so mine could be comfortable. "I'm sure." We worked until almost midnight, going through every file, with Margaret taking notes and asking questions and building the framework for what she said would be one of the biggest ethics cases in state history. She recorded my statement, my account of finding the files, my description of David's final words and his letter of confession. She took photos of every document, backed them up to secure servers, started the chain of custody that would eventually lead these files into official investigations. When I finally drove home, exhausted and empty, Sarah's car was in the driveway. I found her asleep on the living room couch, still in her work clothes, her phone clutched in her hand as if she'd been waiting for me to call. I stood looking at her for a long moment, this beautiful young woman who believed so fiercely in justice, who had no idea that her entire life was built on a foundation of betrayal. "Sarah," I said softly, touching her shoulder. "Wake up, honey. We need to talk." She blinked awake, immediately alert, sitting up and reaching for me. "Mom, you've been gone for 7 hours. I've been terrified. What happened? Where were you?" I sat down beside her, taking her hands in mine. "I found something in the attic," I said. "Something your father left for me. And it's going to change everything we thought we knew about him, about our family, about the life we've been living." "You're scaring me," she whispered. "I know. I'm scared too. But we're going to get through this together. We're going to do the right thing, even though it's hard, even though it hurts. Because that's what matters, Sarah. Not the money, or the reputation, or the comfortable lies. The truth. Justice. That's what your father failed to do, and it's what we're going to do for him." And then I told her everything. I watched her face crumble as I explained what David had done, saw her go through shock and denial and anger and grief in the space of an hour. She cried for the father she'd lost twice, once to cancer and once to the truth. She raged at the unfairness of it all, at the betrayal, at the burden now placed on us. And then, finally, she took a shuddering breath and asked the question I'd been waiting for. "What are we going to do?" "We're going to make it right. Or as right as we can make it after 15 years. I've already filed a complaint with the state bar. Margaret Reeves is opening a full investigation into Morrison and Associates, and we're going to help her in any way we can." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, processing everything I told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken in a way I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. "Everything I have, everything I am, it's all tainted, isn't it? Georgetown, my degree, even this apartment I'm living in that Dad helped me pay the deposit for. It's all built on other people's suffering." "No," I said firmly, gripping her hands tighter. "You are not tainted. You chose to use your degree to help people, to fight for justice. You made different choices than your father did. You're using what you have to do good in the world. That matters, Sarah. That means something." We worked until almost midnight, going through every file, with Margaret taking notes and asking questions and building the framework for what she said would be one of the biggest ethics cases in state history. She recorded my statement, my account of finding the files, my description of David's final words and his letter of confession. She took photos of every document, backed them up to secure servers, started the chain of custody that would eventually lead these files into official investigations. When I finally drove home, exhausted and empty, Sarah's car was in the driveway. I found her asleep on the living room couch, still in her work clothes, her phone clutched in her hand as if she'd been waiting for me to call. I stood looking at her for a long moment, this beautiful young woman who believed so fiercely in justice, who had no idea that her entire life was built on a foundation of betrayal. "Sarah," I said softly, touching her shoulder, "wake up, honey. We need to talk." She blinked awake, immediately alert, sitting up and reaching for me. "Mom, you've been gone for 7 hours. I've been terrified. What happened? Where were you?" I sat down beside her, taking her hands in mine. "I found something in the attic," I said. "Something your father left for me. And it's going to change everything we thought we knew about him, about our family, about the life we've been living." "You're scaring me," she whispered. "I know. I'm scared too. but we're going to get through this together. We're going to do the right thing, even though it's hard, even though it hurts. Because that's what matters, Sarah. Not the money, or the reputation, or the comfortable lies. The truth. Justice. That's what your father failed to do, and it's what we're going to do for him. And then I told her everything. I watched her face crumble as I explained what David had done, saw her go through shock and denial and anger and grief in the space of an hour. She cried for the father she'd lost twice, once to cancer and once to the truth. She raged at the unfairness of it all, at the betrayal, at the burden now placed on us. And then, finally, she took a shuddering breath and asked the question I'd been waiting for. What are we going to do? We're going to make it right. Or as right as we can make it after 15 years. I've already filed a complaint with the state bar. Margaret Reeves is opening a full investigation into Morrison and Associates, and we're going to help her in any way we can. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands, processing everything I told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken in a way I hadn't heard since she was a little girl. Everything I have, everything I am, it's all tainted, isn't it? Georgetown, my degree, even this apartment I'm living in that Dad helped me pay the deposit for. It's all built on other people's suffering. No, I said firmly, gripping her hands tighter. You are not tainted. You chose to use your degree to help people, to fight for justice. You made different choices than your father did. You're using what you have to do good in the world. That matters, Sarah. That means something. The hardest part was watching what it did to Sarah. She took a leave of absence from her job, unable to focus on her cases while her entire world was being picked apart on national television. She moved back home for a while, and I'd find her at 2 a.m, sitting in David's study, reading through his old case files as if she could find some explanation, some justification, some way to reconcile the father she'd loved with the man he'd actually been. I keep trying to remember signs, she said one night, sitting on the floor surrounded by papers, her eyes red from crying. Moments where I should have known something was wrong. But there weren't any, Mom. He was just Dad. He made pancakes on Sunday mornings and helped me with my homework and came to every single one of my soccer games. He was good. He was kind. How do I reconcile that with this? I don't think we do reconcile it, I said, sitting down beside her on the floor. I think we just have to hold both truths at the same time. He was good and kind in so many ways, and he also did terrible things. People are complicated, Sarah. They're capable of great love and great harm, sometimes simultaneously. Your father loved you more than anything in this world, and he also made choices that hurt people. Both things are true. I hate that, she whispered. I hate how complicated it is. I want to either forgive him completely or hate him completely. This middle ground is torture. I know, I said, putting my arm around her. Believe me, I know. In April, 5 months after I'd found the files in the attic, I got a call from a woman named Jennifer Hartwell. She was one of the plaintiffs in the original Hartley manufacturing case, the one that had started everything. Her son, Michael, was now 17, still suffering from the developmental disabilities caused by chemical exposure in utero. She'd read about the investigation, about the documents David had buried, and she wanted to meet with me. I almost said no. The thought of facing one of the people David had harmed, of looking into the eyes of someone whose suffering had paid for my comfortable life, was almost more than I could bear. But I'd asked for this when I opened that plastic container in the attic. I'd chosen truth over comfort, and truth came with a price. We met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory, with Margaret Reeves present as a buffer. Jennifer Hartwell was 43 years old, but looked older, her face lined with the kind of exhaustion that comes from years of fighting a system that doesn't care about you. She brought a photo of Michael, showed it to me before she said anything else. "This is my son," she said, and her voice was steady, but her hand shook slightly as she held out the picture. "He's 17 now. He can't speak clearly, can't read above a third-grade level, needs supervision for most daily activities. He's a good kid, sweet, gentle. He didn't deserve what happened to him." "I know," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." "I didn't come here for your apology," she said, not unkindly. "I came to say thank you." I stared at her, certain I'd heard wrong. "Thank you?"
"For telling the truth," she said, "for giving up everything to make sure people knew what happened. When we settled that case in 2011, we knew something was wrong. We knew there had to be more evidence than what was presented. But we were tired, we were broke, and the lawyer said this was the best we could do. We took the money and tried to move forward. But it's haunted me for 13 years, wondering if I'd failed Michael by giving up too soon." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "What you did, Mrs. Thornton, it proved we were right. It validated every instinct we'd had that we were being cheated, being lied to. And now, because of those documents you turned over, we're filing a motion to reopen the case. Other families are too. We might actually get real justice this time, and real compensation that could change Michael's life, get him the therapy he needs, maybe set him up with a trust that will take care of him after I'm gone. You gave us that chance, so thank you." I broke down then, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since that night in the attic when I'd first read David's letter. Jennifer reached across the table and took my hand. This woman I'd never met, whose life had been destroyed by my husband's choices, and she held on while I sobbed out months of grief and guilt and confusion. "Your husband did a terrible thing," she said when I'd finally gotten control of myself. "But at the end, he tried to make it right. That doesn't erase the harm, but it matters. And you're the one who finished what he started. That matters even more." Over the following weeks, I heard from more victims. The Westbrook Pharmaceuticals case, where David had buried evidence about a drug that caused heart attacks in elderly patients. The Sunrise Nursing Homes case, where he'd hidden documents about systematic neglect and abuse. The Cascade Construction case, where he'd concealed reports about unsafe working conditions that had led to 3 deaths. Each person had a story. Each person had been harmed. And each person was now filing to reopen their case based on the evidence David had preserved. Not all of them were kind to me. Some were angry that I'd benefited for so long from their suffering. Some blamed me for not knowing, for not seeing, for not stopping David before so much damage was done. I took their anger without defending myself, because what defense could I possibly offer? I hadn't known, but maybe I should have known. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, asked more questions, demanded more honesty, David would have broken down and told me the truth years ago, and we could have stopped this sooner. But maybe not. Maybe David would have just gotten better at hiding it. Maybe I would have chosen to look away, to preserve the comfortable life I'd grown accustomed to. I'll never know, and that uncertainty is something I'll carry forever. By June, 7 of the original 30 cases had been reopened. The legal process was slow and complicated, but Margaret Reeves was optimistic that most of them would result in substantial new settlements now that the full evidence could be presented. She estimated that the victims collectively could receive an additional $40 to $60 million in compensation that they should have gotten years ago. I made a decision then that Sarah fought me on for weeks.
I announced through Margaret that I would be donating David's entire life insurance payout, all $500,000, to be divided among the victims of the cases that couldn't be reopened due to expired statutes of limitation. It wasn't nearly enough to compensate for what they'd lost, but it was something. It was all I had to give. "Mom, that's your security," Sarah argued. "That's your retirement. Dad left that money for you to live on. You can't just give it away." "I can and I will," I said. "That money was earned through corruption, Sarah. Every dollar of it feels dirty to me. I can't spend it on groceries or utilities or a new car without thinking about where it came from. I'd rather be poor and able to sleep at night than comfortable and haunted." "Then what are you going to live on?" she demanded. "You're 51 years old. You can't work full-time as a nurse anymore. Your back can't take it. What's your plan?" "I'll figure it out," I said. "I'll go back to full-time nursing. I'll downsize the house. I'll do whatever I need to do, but I won't keep that money, Sarah. I can't." She didn't speak to me for 3 days after that conversation. When she finally called, it was to tell me she'd made her own decision. She was donating her entire savings account, $23,000 she'd been building since college, to the same fund. "If you're going to be stubborn and righteous," she said, "then I'm going to be stubborn and righteous too. We're in this together, Mom." I tried to talk her out of it, but she had my determination, my refusal to compromise when it came to doing what was right. In the end, I was proud of her. She was choosing her values over her comfort, exactly as I'd raised her to do, exactly as David had failed to do. The house on Maple Street went up for sale in July. I couldn't afford the mortgage on a nurse's salary, and even if I could, I didn't want to live there anymore. Every room held memories that had been recontextualized by the truth, tainted by the knowledge of how it had all been paid for. The kitchen we'd renovated for $43,000. The master bathroom with the expensive tile David had insisted on. The deck where we'd hosted summer barbecues for 20 years. All of it felt like crime scenes now. I found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a less expensive part of town, close to the hospital where I'd gone back to working full-time. My back did hurt. My feet ached after 12-hour shifts, but I needed to work. Needed to feel like I was earning my keep honestly, producing something of value with my own hands and skills. I helped people heal, eased suffering where I could, held the hands of dying patients and their grieving families. It was hard work, but it was clean work, and that mattered more than I could express. Sarah came to visit me in my new apartment one evening in August, 10 months after David's death. 9 months after I'd opened the plastic container in the attic and set all of this in motion. We sat on my secondhand couch drinking wine from mismatched glasses I'd bought at Goodwill, and for the first time in months, we could talk about David without one or both of us ending up in tears. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sarah told me, "about how people are complicated, how we have to hold multiple truths at the same time, and I think I'm starting to understand it. Dad was a good father and a bad lawyer. He loved us and he hurt others. He was weak when it mattered most, but he tried to be strong at the end. All of those things are true." "Have you forgiven him?" I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. She thought about it for a long time, swirling the wine in her glass. "I don't know if forgive is the right word," she finally said. "I understand him better now. I see how the choices he made seemed small at first, how he justified them by telling himself he was protecting his family, how each compromise made the next one easier until he was someone he didn't recognize. I can see how that happens, how good people can do bad things if they're not vigilant, if they prioritize the wrong values. And that terrifies me, Mom, because it means I could do the same thing if I'm not careful." "But you won't," I said, "because you're aware of it now. You've seen the consequences up close. You know what's at stake." "I hope so," she said. I'm back at work now, and every time I'm faced with a decision, every time there's a temptation to cut a corner or bend a rule, I think about Dad. I think about those families, about Jennifer Hartwell and her son Michael, about all the people whose lives were damaged because someone decided their own comfort was more important than doing the right thing. And I choose differently. That's his legacy then, I said. Not the corruption, not the buried evidence, but the lesson, the warning, the example of what not to do. Do you think he'd be proud of us? Sarah asked quietly. Of what we did with his confession? I considered the question carefully, thinking about David in his final days, about the letter he'd written, about his last words sending me to the attic. I think he'd be proud that we had the courage he couldn't find. I think he'd be relieved that someone finally did what needed to be done. And I think he'd be grateful that we loved him enough to care about making amends, even when it cost us everything. The State Bar Association's final report was released in September, 11 months after David's death. It documented systemic ethics violations at Morrison and Associates spanning 23 years, involving at least 17 attorneys, affecting an estimated 240 cases. The report recommended license suspensions, monetary penalties, and criminal investigation into several attorneys who were still alive and could face prosecution. Morrison himself, now 78 years old and in declining health, lost his law license permanently and faced potential criminal charges for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The report also included a section about David, about his cooperation through the evidence he'd preserved, about his letter of confession, about his attempt at the end of his life to rectify the harm he'd done. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it acknowledged that his actions had been instrumental in uncovering a pattern of corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. In some small way, that vindicated my choice to come forward, validated the belief that David's confession had mattered, that his suffering and guilt had meant something in the end. I framed a copy of his letter and hung it in my apartment, not as a tribute, but as a reminder. Every day I looked at his handwriting, at his admission of failure, at his request that I be brave in the way he hadn't been, and every day I recommitted myself to living differently, to choosing integrity over comfort, to being someone who could look at myself in the mirror without flinching. A year after David's death, on the anniversary of that night when he'd whispered, "Check the attic," with his last breath, I drove to the cemetery where he was buried. I'd only been there once since the funeral, too angry and hurt and confused to face his grave. But now, with a year of distance and healing and hard-won clarity, I felt ready to talk to him. His headstone was simple, just his name and dates and the inscription Sarah and I had chosen, "Beloved husband and father." No mention of his profession, no listing of his accomplishments. After everything came out, we'd considered changing it to something that reflected the complexity of who he'd been, but in the end, we'd left it alone. He had been beloved. That was true regardless of everything else. I sat down on the grass beside his grave, not caring that it was damp from morning dew. "Hi, David," I said, feeling foolish but needing to speak the words anyway. "It's been quite a year. I'm sure you've been watching, if that's possible, if there's anything beyond this life. I hope you have been. I hope you saw what we did with your confession, how we tried to honor your last request, how we sacrificed comfort and reputation and financial security to make things right." A breeze rustled through the trees surrounding the cemetery, carrying the smell of autumn leaves and approaching rain. I pulled my jacket tighter and it continued, "I'm angry with you still. I don't know if that will ever completely go away. You lied to me for 15 years, David. You let me believe we were good people living a good life when the truth was so much more complicated. You robbed me of the choice to be complicit or not, to participate in your corruption, or to demand better. That betrayal, that theft of my agency, that's going to take a long time to forgive. I picked up a fallen leaf, turning it over in my fingers, watching the veins run through the red and gold surface. But I understand better now why you did it. I see how the pressures mounted, how you felt trapped by your own choices, how each day made it harder to come clean. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. And I think, at the end, you did everything you could to make amends. You gave us the truth when the truth was all you had left to give. That took courage, David. More courage than most people have. I set the leaf on his headstone, a small offering. The cases are being resolved. Most of the families are getting the compensation they should have gotten years ago. Jennifer Hartwell's son, Michael, is going to be set for life now, with proper care and therapy and a trust fund that will outlive his mother. That wouldn't have happened without you, without the evidence you preserved, without your confession. So you did save them in the end. You just couldn't save yourself. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the cemetery grounds. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of traffic, the city continuing its daily rhythms, indifferent to personal tragedies and moral reckonings. Sarah and I are okay, I said. We're not wealthy anymore, we're not comfortable, but we're okay. We're proud of what we did, proud that we chose justice over reputation. She's back at her job defending immigrants, fighting harder than ever because she knows what's at stake when the system fails people. And I'm nursing again, full time, taking care of people, doing honest work that helps more than it harms. We're building a new legacy, David, one based on integrity instead of compromise. I stood up, brushing grass from my jeans, preparing to leave but needing to say one final thing. I loved you. I still love you, though it's a more complicated love now. One that has to make room for disappointment and anger and betrayal, alongside the tenderness and joy and partnership we shared. I wish you'd been braver sooner. I wish you trusted me enough to share your burden when it was happening instead of leaving it for me to carry after you were gone. But I'm grateful you gave me the chance to make it right. Grateful you believed I was strong enough to do what you couldn't. I won't let you down, David. I'll keep fighting for those families, keep pushing for accountability, keep being the person you wanted to be but couldn't quite manage. That's my promise to you, my final vow. Rest in peace, my love. You earned it. I walk back to my car, feeling lighter somehow, as if the conversation had released something I'd been holding too tightly. The anniversary had passed. The year of mourning and revelation and reconstruction was complete. Now came the work of living with what I knew, of building a life that honored the truth even when the truth was painful. As I drove out of the cemetery, my phone rang. It was Margaret Reeves. "Rebecca," she said, and I could hear excitement in her voice. "I wanted you to be the first to know. The final settlement came through on the Hartley case. With the new evidence, the families are receiving a combined $42 million. That's more than 15 times what they got in the original settlement. Jennifer Hartwell alone is getting $3.8 million from Michael's care. You did this, Rebecca. You and David's evidence. You changed these people's lives." I pulled over to the side of the road, unable to drive through the tears that were suddenly streaming down my face. "Thank you for telling me," I managed to say. "Thank you for everything you've done." "Thank you for having the courage to come forward," she said. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have protected the comfortable lie instead of embracing the difficult truth. You're remarkable, Rebecca Thornton. Don't ever forget that." After we hung up, I sat in my car on the side of the road, crying and laughing simultaneously, feeling a complex mix of grief and relief and pride. $42 million. $3.8 million from Michael Hartwell, the boy whose suffering had helped pay for my daughter's education. The boy who would now have everything he needed for the rest of his life because I'd chosen to check the attic, to read the letter, to turn over the files, to do the hard and painful thing instead of the easy and comfortable thing. David had said in his letter that he didn't expect me to forgive him, that he didn't even want me to forgive him. But sitting there in my car, thinking about Jennifer Hartwell's face when she thanked me, thinking about Michael's future now secured, thinking about all the families who would finally get justice because David had documented his sins and asked me to expose them, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps something close to it. Acceptance, maybe. Understanding. A recognition that people are capable of both terrible failures and redemptive actions, sometimes within the same life, sometimes within the same choice. David had failed for 15 years, but in his final act, in his deathbed confession, in his careful preservation of evidence, and his letter sending me to the attic, he had succeeded. He had given me the tools to make amends on his behalf, to transform his corruption into justice, his silence into truth. It wasn't enough to erase what he'd done, but it was something. It was a start. I started the car again and drove toward home, toward my small apartment and my honest work and my daughter who was learning to be better than her father had been. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the road, and I thought about the plastic container in the attic, about David's last words, about the moment when I'd chosen to open that envelope instead of burning it unread. That choice had cost me everything I'd built over 23 years of marriage. My comfortable home, my financial security, my unblemished memories, my faith in the man I'd loved. But it had given me something more valuable in return. It had given me integrity. It had given me the knowledge that when faced with the choice between comfort and justice, I had chosen justice. It had given me the ability to look my daughter in the eye and know that I had taught her by example what it meant to do the right thing, even when the right thing destroyed you.
In the end, that was what David's confession had given us. Not absolution, not redemption, not even really forgiveness, but the chance to be better than we had been, to build something honest from the ashes of comfortable lies, to live with integrity, even when integrity was expensive and painful and lonely. In the end, it was all about giving Michael a chance to live his life without being haunted by the memory of what David had done, and that was something that David couldn't do if he continued to live a false life. "Check the attic," David had said with his dying breath, and I had, and it had changed everything, just as he'd known it would. The life I'd thought I was living was gone, revealed as a fiction, built on other people's suffering. But the life I was building now, the life Sarah and I were creating from honest work and difficult choices and a commitment to truth, regardless of cost, that life was real. That life was mine. That life was worth whatever it had cost to claim it. As I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment building, I made a decision. I would write my own letter, my own account of what had happened this year, my own testimony about the cost of silence and the price of truth. Maybe someday it would help someone else faced with an impossible choice, someone trying to decide whether to protect a comfortable lie or embrace a difficult truth. Maybe it would serve as a warning or an encouragement, or simply as evidence that people can change, can choose courage, even after years of choosing comfort, can rebuild their lives from rubble and make something good from the wreckage. I didn't know if David could see me from wherever the dead go.
If there was consciousness beyond the grave that allowed him to watch what had unfolded from his confession, but I hoped he could. I hoped he saw Jennifer Hartwell's tears of relief when she learned about Michael's settlement. I hoped he saw Sarah at her desk, defending clients with fierce integrity, making different choices than he had made. I hoped he saw me in my small apartment with my secondhand furniture and my honest paycheck, sleeping soundly for the first time in years because I had nothing to hide, no secrets to keep, no compromises eating away at my conscience. And I hoped he understood that his last words, "Check the attic," had been the most important thing he'd ever said to me. More important than "I love you," more important than "Will you marry me?" More important than all the sweet nothings and tender promises of our 23 years together. Because those last words had given me the chance to choose who I wanted to be, who I wanted Sarah to be, what kind of legacy we would carry forward from the complicated, flawed, ultimately human man who had been my husband. I checked the attic, David, just like you asked. And yes, it changed everything. It destroyed the life we built together, exposed your failures, cost us our comfort and our reputation and our carefully maintained illusions, but it also gave us something you never had in all those years of strategic filing and buried evidence and panic attacks and therapy sessions. It gave us integrity. It gave us peace. It gave us the ability to look in the mirror and recognize the people looking back. That was your final gift to me, to us, to all those families you'd harmed. Not the life insurance money, or the house on Maple Street, or the comfortable existence we enjoyed for so many years, but the truth, the burden of truth and the freedom it brings, the terrible, beautiful, necessary choice between what's easy and what's right. Thank you for that, David, and goodbye.